Hi, and welcome to English-Fabule. Are you learning English? Great. Let's learn English with a very interesting story. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Let's get started.
New Zealand is a country far away in the ocean. Many people think it is small, but it is bigger than you might think. For example, New Zealand is even larger than the United Kingdom. Both countries have a similar climate. The weather in New Zealand is good for people to live in. It has mild winters and warm summers, with rain all year. This type of weather is called oceanic or temperate. Many places with this kind of climate, like parts of Europe, are very full of people. But New Zealand is different. The United Kingdom has almost 69 million people. New Zealand, however, has only a little more than 5 million people. This is about 14 times fewer people than the UK. If you look at how many people live in one area, the UK has 281 people for every square kilometer. New Zealand has only 18 people for every square kilometer. This means the UK is 15 times more crowded than New Zealand. This is a very big difference, especially since New Zealand is a large country with good weather. Most of New Zealand's land is empty. Around 80% of the country has no people living on it. This emptiness is even stranger when you look closer. Most people, more than 3/4, live on the North Island. The South Island is bigger, but fewer people live there. On the North Island, almost half of all people live in just one city, Auckland. Auckland is the biggest city in New Zealand, and nearly 2 million people live there. This means many people live close together in a few places, while much of the country remains very empty. So, why is New Zealand, a country that is big and has good weather, so empty? This book will try to answer this interesting question. 2. Far away from everything. New Zealand is a country far away from other places. Some people divide Earth into two parts, a land hemisphere and a water hemisphere. New Zealand sits almost in the very center of the water hemisphere. This means it is surrounded by a lot of ocean. The closest large country to New Zealand is Australia. But even Australia is not very close. There is almost 2,000 kilometers of open ocean called the Tasman Sea between them. This long distance makes travel difficult. Even now, in modern times, air and sea travel around this part of the world is not common. If you want to fly from Auckland in New Zealand to Sydney in Australia, it takes about 4 hours. This is like flying from London to Athens in Europe. That's just to the closest neighbor. To reach Europe, New Zealand is one of the furthest places you can go on Earth. For example, it is directly opposite places like Spain and Portugal on the globe. Because of this, it takes a long time to travel to or from New Zealand, even with today's fast planes. It is thousands of kilometers from big cities and many people. Beyond Australia, there are only small islands, Antarctica, or empty ocean for a very long way. This great distance from the world's main population centers is a big reason why New Zealand feels so empty. It is truly far away from everything. 3. The first people arrive. New Zealand was the last large place on Earth where people could live that was found. For a very long time, no humans lived there. It was a natural place, untouched by anyone. This changed around the 13th century. At this time, a group of brave explorers came from Polynesia. They likely found the islands by chance. These first people developed a special culture and became known as the Maori. They lived on the islands for many centuries. Other people from the outside world did not visit for a long time. Then, in the middle of the 17th century, a Dutch sailor was the first non-Polynesian person to see the islands. But regular contact with Europeans did not start until later, in the year 1769. This was when the British sailor Captain Cook arrived. He came almost 500 years after the Maori had first settled there. This means that New Zealand had much less time to grow its population compared to other islands. For example, islands like Great Britain or Japan had people living on them for tens of thousands of years. They were closer to big continents, so people found them very early. By the 13th century, when New Zealand had 0 people, places like Japan and Great Britain already had populations in the millions. These older islands had a lot more time for their populations to grow naturally. The Maori started with a completely empty land only about 800 years ago. This is not a very long time in history. When the British arrived around the year 1769, there were about 200,000 Maori people living in New Zealand. But after Europeans came, the Maori population sadly became much smaller. Many things caused this. Europeans brought new diseases that the Maori had no protection against. There were also wars and fighting between the new settlers and the Maori. A new legal system was also brought in, which the Maori did not know. Because of all these things, the number of Maori people went down greatly. By the year 1890, their population was only around 40,000. At the same time, many European settlers, mostly from Britain and Ireland, came to New Zealand. Around 500,000 new people arrived by then. They changed the islands a lot and settled there. 4. Moving from south to north. When European people first came to New Zealand, most chose to live on the South Island. This was a change from today, as the South Island once had more people than the North Island in the 1800s and early 1900s. 2 main reasons led to this. First, gold was found on the South Island. Many people traveled there hoping to get rich, bringing a lot of new settlers to the country's south. Second, the North Island had more Maori people. There were often wars and fights between the Maori and the European settlers. People felt safer on the South Island, away from these conflicts. Because of the gold and fewer problems, the South Island grew quickly in population during the first years of European settlement. However, this changed in the 20th century. People began to move from the South Island to the North Island. Over time, the North Island became home to most New Zealanders. Today, over 3/4 of New Zealand's people live on the North Island. The North Island offered more land suitable for towns and farms once the gold rush ended and northern conflicts lessened. It also had other benefits for living. Auckland, the largest city, is on the North Island. Nearly half of all North Island residents live in or near Auckland. This shows a big shift in settlement from the South Island to the north since the first Europeans arrived. 5. The difficult South Island. The South Island of New Zealand has huge mountains. These mountains are called the Southern Alps. They run almost all along the island's length. These mountains are very tall. Many peaks are over 3,000 meters high, and the tallest stands at almost 3,700 meters. These big mountains make it hard for people to live and build towns. Creating roads and houses on or through mountains is much more difficult and costs a lot more money than building on flat land. The Southern Alps take up a lot of space that could be used for cities or farms, limiting where people can settle. These mountains also create a special weather effect called a rain shadow. Strong winds blow from the west across the Tasman Sea. This air carries a lot of moisture. When this wet air hits the high Southern Alps, it must go up and over them. As it climbs higher, it cools down, and the water in the air turns into heavy rain. So, the narrow strip of land on the west coast of the South Island gets a large amount of rainfall. It is often very wet there, making development challenging due to the constant moisture and rugged terrain. After the air drops its rain on the west side, it crosses over the mountains. By this point, the air has lost most of its moisture. As it moves down the eastern side of the mountains, it gets warmer and drier. This dry, warm wind then blows across the eastern plains of the South Island. Because of this, the east coast does not receive much rain. It often faces dry, almost desert-like conditions, which makes growing crops very difficult without extra water. So, the South Island has two main problems for a large population. The west coast has many rugged mountains and too much rain, which makes building and farming difficult. The east coast is flatter and might be easier to build on, but it does not get enough natural rainfall for easy crop growing. These natural features make the South Island a challenging place for many people to live and build large communities, even today. This explains why fewer people live here compared to the North Island. 6. The easier North Island. The North Island is different from the South Island in important ways. It has much less mountainous land. This means there is more flat land available. This flat land is easier to use for building cities, towns, and roads. It is also simpler to develop for farms. Rainfall on the North Island is more balanced and predictable. Unlike the South Island, there are not massive mountain ranges that create a rain shadow effect. This means rain falls more evenly across the island. Farmers can rely on this steady rainfall to water their crops and feed their animals. The lack of extreme wet or dry areas makes agriculture a more stable activity here.
The North Island also enjoys warmer weather. Because it lies further north and closer to the equator, especially around its larger cities like Auckland, the average temperatures are higher. These mild winters and warm summers create a more pleasant environment for daily life and make outdoor activities possible for more of the year. Another advantage comes from its volcanoes. While both islands have volcanoes, only the North Island has active ones.
Over time, small eruptions add minerals to the soil. This volcanic ash helps make the ground more fertile. This type of rich, productive soil is very good for growing different kinds of food. In contrast, the South Island's volcanoes have not erupted for centuries, so their soils do not get these natural benefits. These natural conditions, more flat land, dependable rainfall, warmer temperatures, and fertile volcanic soil, make the North Island much more suitable for human settlement and agriculture. It is easier to build infrastructure and to grow food. This explains why the North Island eventually became home to most New Zealanders. After the gold rush era on the South Island finished and conflicts in the North Island lessened, people moved to where life was easier. However, it is important to understand that even the North Island's fertile soil is not as rich as some other places. Its volcanoes do not erupt as often as in countries like Japan or Indonesia. So, while it is better than the South Island, New Zealand's North Island still faces some natural limits for growing a huge amount of crops. But these better conditions, compared to the difficult South Island, were key in making it the most populated part of the country. 7. A country of animals. New Zealand's land is special. Most of it is not good for growing common crops like wheat or corn. Only a very small part, less than 2% of the country's total land, is flat and fertile enough for planting crops. This situation is similar to countries like Jordan, which have large desert areas, showing how challenging the land is for traditional plant farming. The many mountains, varying rainfall patterns across the islands, and a general lack of very rich soil make it hard to grow large amounts of plant crops for sale to others. However, New Zealand has a mild, temperate climate, enough water in some areas, and plentiful natural grasses. These conditions are perfect for raising animals that eat grass. Because of this, New Zealand built its entire farming industry around cows and sheep. The country brought in many of these animals, and now they are a huge part of the landscape and the economy. Today, there are many more animals than people in New Zealand. For example, there are almost 27 million sheep across the islands. That is about 5 times more sheep than the 5 million humans currently living there. New Zealand is now the world's biggest exporter of sheep products, like wool and mutton. But sheep products are not their largest export. New Zealand also has more than twice as many cows as people. Products from these cows, especially dairy, make up the country's biggest single export item. Animal farming uses a large portion of New Zealand's land. Even though only a tiny part of the land is considered suitable for growing crops, a significant amount, more than half of the country's total land, is actively used for agriculture. This means most of this agricultural land is dedicated to raising animals instead of growing plants. The country's distant location and unique geography essentially guided it into becoming a large offshore farm focused on animals. After gold mining became less profitable in the past, there were not many other valuable minerals or oil to extract and sell. Because New Zealand produces so much food from its animals, it can feed a large global population. It produces enough food to feed around 40 million people each year. This is about 8 times more food than its own population needs. Therefore, about 95% of this food is sold to other countries around the world. In 2019, these exports brought in a huge income, totaling over 46 billion New Zealand dollars. Animal agriculture has been the main part of New Zealand's exports for nearly 200 years, and it is still the foundation of its economy today. This focus on animal farming, which needs a lot of space for grazing, limits the ability for people to spread out and settle across the islands even further. 8. The country today and tomorrow. New Zealand is a big country with a surprisingly small population. We have seen why this is. First, it is very far from other large lands. It sits alone in the ocean. This made it the last big place on Earth for people to find, around 800 years ago. Its distant location means travel takes a long time, even now. Second, much of its land is hard to live on. The South Island has tall mountains, making building difficult. It also has strange weather, making some areas too wet and others too dry for farming. The North Island has more flat land and better rain. But only a small part of the country, about 2%, is good for growing crops. So most land is used for raising animals, like sheep and cows, which means fewer places for people to settle. Third, New Zealand's history of settlement is short. The Maori arrived in the 13th century, and Europeans later. Other lands had much more time for their populations to grow. When Europeans came, the Maori population faced challenges, including new diseases. These things together mean New Zealand has always had fewer people. Today, New Zealand's population is growing faster, largely from new immigrants. The government plans for this, setting yearly goals. Many new people come from Asia, such as China, India, and the Philippines, more than from Europe. Over 1/4 of New Zealand's residents were born in another country. However, most new people move to Auckland, the biggest city. It has good connections to the world. Because many people want to live there, houses are very expensive. In 2022, an average house cost over 1.1 million US dollars, while the average yearly salary was only about 44,000 US dollars. This makes buying a home in Auckland very hard. The government understands these issues. They plan for the future using careful thinking. They know the natural limits of their islands. So, while most of New Zealand is empty, the places where people live are getting crowded. If you could move to New Zealand, would you choose the busy North Island or the empty South Island, and why?
Hey there! Just a second before you go. If you learned something new today, please give this video a like, write your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel. It only takes a second, and it really, really helps to create even better English videos for you. Your support means the world. Thank you.